Well, hello. My name's Nate Radcliffe. Talking about reimbursement, and as far as I can tell, my qualification for being up here is that I'm used to rejection and willing to work for free. But as a practicing ophthalmologist in New York City, I guess I bump into the reimbursement world from time to time, and we have a great panel here with a lot of different experiences, and so I think we'll go maybe starting with you, Ron, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. Ron Gilliland, CEO of VEO Ophthalmics. We are primarily focused on the artificial iris here in the U.S. market. We launched the device in 2018, and since then have been trying to expand patient access, and reimbursement has been a key role of that.
Great. Hi, Ed Holland. Wow. I'm a professor of ophthalmology, University of Cincinnati, and director of the Cornea Service. Also a senior scientific advisor for Alcon.
Cindy?
Hi, I'm Cindy Metrose. I'm with Zeiss Meditec, and I look after strategic accounts, academic centers, and our digital business.
Nancy Schwartz with Alcon. I lead the U.S. Market Access Organization, so really, focused on reimbursement, patient affordability, and a little bit of government affairs because they play such a key role in our path forward.
Hi, Emily Graham. I am with a lobbying and consulting firm in Washington, D.C., Hart Health Strategies. I've been there for about 12 years and primarily work on regulatory issues that include Medicare reimbursement. I was so glad to hear you say government affairs is important because that's probably my primary talking point. And some of you may recognize me because I was staff with ASCRS for almost 8 years under Nancy McCann several years ago.
Well, thank you. So, we have a group here, and of course, in our audience, a variety of innovators, and, we all kind of are interacting with each other in various ways, and I think at a certain level, we may not even know when we need some of the talent that's up here on stage, but I thought I'd start with you, Dr. Holland, to, you work with a lot of companies, particularly in the dry eye cataract space, but you're a clinician as well. What's the landscape that we're dealing with today?
Well, increasingly I see frustrations with actually the payers. So I give an example of a startup company in dry eye, and you talk about one of the biggest unmet need. We have 30 to 40 million dry patients in the U.S. alone. We have 3 approved topical therapies for dry eye, and it's, and a lot of companies just stay away because it's too complicated. And I give an example of talking with some startup companies. They may have a drug that is incredibly good to reduce the symptoms of dry eye, but it's going to be tough to say hit a sign. So they're worried about approval, right? So, if the approval is you hit a sign and a symptom, repeat it. Now they can get an approval on one of those, but then their label is different, and then they're worried what the payers are going to say. So even though as a clinician, I think the patients with dry eye are most concerned about pain, and I could have an incredible drug to reduce pain. If it does get approved, it's going to be at the end of the line, and I'm not going to be able to use it until I fail all the other therapies. And I see payers really affecting the way I get to practice medicine. For instance, difluprednate is the most potent topical steroid we have. 100% of the time now, if I write difluprednate, I have to fail dexamethasone or prednisolone. And the patient has to go through this struggle, and I know I have a better drug. Same thing with loteprednol. Loteprednol is a unique molecule that doesn't raise IOP like other steroids. I probably get denied 70% of the time if I write that. So for me, the payers are really, really affecting the way I practice medicine, and I think they're affecting the way companies look at should they take a risk of trying to bring a drug to market.
Okay, and right to you then, Ron. So you've been walking this journey. Perhaps you can tell us when you started to formulate your reimbursement strategy and whether there's anything you would do differently or any pearls you could share with those kind of walking that path in our audience.
The short answer is not soon enough. We launched the product in 2018, and although we knew reimbursement was going to be critically important, our primary focus at the time was getting it out to patients who had been waiting for years because there was no solution for them, basically. But then we developed a strategy very quickly, and as we lived through it, I would echo some of Dr. Holland's comments about the problems with some of the payers. Our strategy included going to Category 3 codes first. Actually, take that back. CMS for a code to pay for the device, a HCPCS code first. Then we went to the AMA and picked up the CPT codes, but we chose strategically to do Category 3. And since that time, we've been able to, that allowed us to get into codes sooner and get a code that paid sooner without all the requirements that come with a Category 1 code. Since that time, we've actually been able to get through the Category 1 code application, and we'll finally have that. But it's been a long journey.
Yeah, and that is we could have a whole session on which one is worse, a Category 3 code or a Category 1 code. I think we initially thought that the T codes were challenging because you didn't have guaranteed reimbursement, but now often we see here's your Category 1 CPT code and the reimbursement is $2.83. So Emily, let me ask you a question. I'm in my basement laboratory and I've cured glaucoma. Should my first phone call be to a lobbyist?
Absolutely.
Take us through, how early you tend to get involved with people, and I would love to hear a success story. So what is a situation where you think that early involvement really was helpful for, and it could be a case from a colleague or anything.
Sure. I'm trying to think of a success story, but I think that it's incredibly important to start working in Washington and to take the blinders off. FDA approval is certainly extremely important and a very high bar and what you want to go for, but I think oftentimes we find that groups forget all about the reimbursement part and what happens after a FDA approval, and they maybe make an assumption that it's going to be easy to go through that process, or that it's just obvious, like we have this great technology, why wouldn't somebody pay for it? And that isn't really the case. And I think a lot of times, the pitfalls that we see that companies have made, especially the smaller ones, is when they were setting up their trials, for example, they weren't asking, certain questions that would make the endpoints generalizable to a Medicare population. I think that's, one of the biggest challenges that we see. I think the other challenge that we sometimes see is that the folks that are sitting on the board don't really have a lot of political savvy, and so when they find themselves running into a problem, they don't necessarily know who to call, and it's oftentimes then that the lobbyist gets the phone call, their hair's on fire, and we're just kind of like yeah, we're absolutely going to assist you, but it's going to be a little difficult because policymakers don't necessarily know who you are. And so now you have your hair's on fire, you have this technology, you're not getting paid, you're running out of your VC money, you can't continue to pay your staff. So we think it makes a whole lot of sense to invest early in a government affairs strategy. In terms of a success story, we have worked with a couple of different companies that brought us on, really early in the process. They were wise to make sure that, some of the questions that they were asking as part of their trial were going to be useful to the Medicare program in terms of, how they looked at coverage for their device. They developed relationships early on with different contractor medical directors because, for example, they knew that they were going to wind up going the LCD route versus, seeking out, some other sort of reimbursement strategy. So, in terms of a name, I probably can't, think of anything, but, government affairs strategy from the outset is incredibly important.
Yeah, and so, and one of the things I've heard a few times today is that, really it's designing those studies is at the point where you're picking endpoints and you're thinking about it clinically, you're thinking about your patients, but if you're not thinking about how those endpoints are going to influence your reimbursement strategy, then, you probably need to go back. And of course, it's real tough to redo a phase 3 clinical trial, isn't it? So Nancy, I thought I would ask you to tell us a little bit about that data that you produce and how that can help you with reimbursement. I can think of a few sort of cynical points of companies with great data. They hit all their outcomes. They did the 5-year trial instead of the 2-year trial. They showed real meaningful patient benefits. And then the reimbursement may not always reflect the quality of the data. So, what's happening there, and how do you get that right?
Well, yeah, reimbursement is certainly, complicated from that perspective, but setting yourself up early in understanding where you're trying to go is critically important, because to Emily's point, right, if we know the reimbursement pathway, we can build the right endpoints in our clinical trials. You know, for your example, you know, thinking about the innovation in surgical glaucoma, right, getting those endpoints right is critically important, generating that evidence so our payers understand how these products are differentiated. But reimbursement is an environment that is kind of dictated to us. So the only thing we can really hang our hats on is the clinical efficacy and safety data from our trials, and the hope that with good data, right, it's driving your decisions as you use those technologies in patients. So what I would say, you know, the other piece is, you know, we oftentimes think about what we need to get FDA approval, but it's also about long-term clinical efficacy and safety data that will help support and sustain reimbursement, or importantly, help command better pricing, right, when we think about the end purchasers.
And this is sort of a question for, you know, just anyone here who wants to tackle it, but, you know, what is it that's compelling payers to be fair and you know, to be reasonable when someone does present that, you know, better than normal data? I mean, what's the pressure, you know, on CMS to actually reward a company that's done this good kind of work? Does it exist? Or, you know, because what we see now is utilization goes up, reimbursement comes down, and not sure I've always seen the quality of the data for the procedure factored into that. And, you know, maybe I'm being cynical, but what's the mechanism by which, you know, we address that?
You know, I think one of the interesting things that I learned through this, I'm not a reimbursement expert by trade, but is utilization as it grows. You're right, it can be negative to reimbursement, but initially you got to show utilization to be able to get the codes. And so for us as a smaller company, that was key, and that's one of the reasons we went with the Category 3 code first instead of the Category 1, is we needed to show some level of utilization, and that was a key thing for us.
I have a question for Emily. I know the answer is to hire a lobbyist first because you told me to say that this morning. So, but what if we have a new drug that I know works faster than lifitegrast or cyclosporin, right? But also if it gets approved, we're going to have to fail most commonly now cyclosporin before we can use this new drug. Hiring you ahead, is there a way around that, or do we just have to fight that battle? Because lots of times that restricts the uptake of that drug, and that company's going to really struggle if every clinician has to have a patient fail cyclosporin.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're talking about like a prior authorization or like a step therapy sort of thing, and yeah, that is very difficult to address. And you know, again, hire a lobbyist. Although I'm trying to think of how much we can do to assist you there. I think that is probably where a lot of the data is going to come in, where you can demonstrate that there's, you know, much more, you know, clinical efficacy with this new drug. Perhaps it's going to lower costs. Perhaps it's going to lower out-of-pocket beneficiary, you know, spending. If there's a way that you can demonstrate that there's going to be significant savings and some sort of improved, you know, quality of life, I think those can be, you know, relatively compelling. And I'm glad you brought this up, because I think one of the things that people forget is that, you know, we are talking a lot about, you know, what's going on in the CMS world, and, you know, reimbursement is budget neutral and what have you, but we don't talk enough about the Medicare Advantage plans, and, you know, half of the Medicare population is now in Medicare Advantage, and so, you know, having those conversations with the plans there is, I think, incredibly important as well. Trying to influence those things. I think the only other thing that I would say is looking at the guidelines. What are the existing, you know, guidelines for some of these things, and how do the guidelines play into it? Because we've seen situations where there's wonderful, robust evidence that, you know, demonstrates that a particular technology, you know, is superior, and they can prove that in so many different ways. But unfortunately, you know, the Specialty Society guideline doesn't recognize it, or and the process is so, you know, long that they find themselves waiting until, you know 5 years, 3 years, whatever that Specialty Society's process is for updating their guidelines. That could be a real issue.
And I know a lot of times they look at those guidelines, they're typically written years ago, and they're very outdated and don't take into account innovation. And unfortunately, sometimes written by academic clinicians who don't really have a high patient volume and don't see the innovation as being useful for many, many years.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
So Cindy, I thought we might switch gears a little bit and head over to the diagnostic side of things. You're with Zeiss, known for really doing intricate things with all this data that we're collecting through our diagnostics. I think anyone who's interacted with the platform can appreciate how much more you can get out of the data when it's all integrated. At the same time, there are costs to that level of data sophistication and handling. And we're still using these kind of really simple CPT codes for our diagnostics that don't quite capture what's happening. And so the question I'd like you to opine on is, is this going to evolve where we are somehow recognized for what we're doing with data beyond just interpreting tests? And are there opportunities to use this type of data for remote monitoring, more intricate telemedicine, and where's this all headed?
So that's a big question, but I would say where we are today is when you're in diagnostics and you're alone in your space, and reimbursement is fine and utilization is growing, that's great. But as competitors come in and they maybe are selling less featured items, it's right for customers to ask, well, why should I spend this when this is good enough, right? And the reimbursement is the same. So it's our job as innovators to do exactly what you're saying, Nate, which is how do we make technology improve the workflow and improve efficiency and effectiveness so that you can see more patients using the best technology and getting that data pool together globally so that we can begin to use AI and machine learning for better diagnostic outcomes.
Oh, great. All right. So we'll sort of end here on a question. I know there's, obviously a lot of work in terms of crafting a reimbursement strategy, and now I'm actually seeing that some are taking the path that's almost a nihilistic path where you're just saying, let's forget about reimbursement and try to do a cash business for medical conditions. So this would be a dry eye drop, not through insurance, try to price it reasonably and sell it that way. Glaucoma, we're seeing this obviously with presbyopia as well. And I'm curious, look, I'm in the Bronx of New York City. Patients are really reluctant to spend a lot of money on things. But what's the potential of this approach? Pluses and minuses. Go ahead.
I can say we're seeing it in wellness screening now. And I think it works if everybody in the practice is all in, with good patient education materials and with the staff being in tune. It can work. And I think the question is it a problem for accessibility for patients that can't afford it? I think that needs to be debated.
We have that example in MGD, right? So the thermal devices we have, there's good data, and there's three or four approved now. And I think most cornea people that take care of a lot of MGD realize they work, but there's pushback from the patients that I have insurance, why do I need to pay cash for this? And there's not a coverage by insurance because the coverage is going to be so low it's not going to be worth it. So, and there's pushback by the doctors who don't incorporate it because they feel like I'm not comfortable asking for money for a dry eye therapy. So it's a difficult slope. I mean, we have a therapy that works, and yet we can't really get it to the masses because of the financial situation we're using.
Well, I think we solved reimbursement. It took us a little while, but so glad we have that behind us today and can move on to conquering the rest of ophthalmology. But thank you to the panel. I do think we could make a whole weekend out of this discussion. It's very intricate, and I really appreciate all your thoughtful responses and look forward to the rest of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.